Hi, I'm your host Vasco Duarte. Welcome to the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast, where we share tips and tricks from Scrum Masters around the world. Every day, we bring you inspiring answers to important questions that all Scrum Masters face day after day. And we will be talking about wonderful workplaces with Yves and Woody. So first, let me welcome our guests for today. Woody Zuill, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's so nice to meet with you again. I always love getting together with you.
Absolutely. And Yves Hanoulle, our co-host in the Tips from the Trenches book. Hi, Yves.
Hi, Vasco. Hi, Woody. It's like Woody said, it's always nice to be here. So welcome to both of you.
Absolutely. And the reason why we ended up recording this episode was that Yves, Woody, and I were talking about Turn Up the Good, which is the tip that Woody has for the Tips from the Trenches audiobook. And we ended up talking about wonderful workplaces. And we're going to talk a lot more about that today. And it started because Woody shared the story of two different workplaces. One that was wonderful and one that was not. So I won't spoil that because I know Woody tells this story beautifully. So Woody, tell us that story.
Okay, well, thanks for giving me an opportunity to share about this. I think that when I was really young, there's a slightly different story that I want to start with. And that was that my very first full-time, real job, it wasn't full-time, but was at a plant nursery where I watered plants. And my boss, I was 12, 13 years old, and my boss treated me as an equal. And he was in his, I think, deep 50s. And he demonstrated that he appreciated my point of view on things. So he would often ask me, how can we make this better? And things like that. So I got experience with this idea that we can always turn up the good when I was quite young. And I've always followed that throughout my life, although I didn't live up to my own expectations of being a great boss like my first boss was. I didn't realize that until I was in my 40s, maybe, where I realized I turned into the boss I would never want to have. And so I started changing myself. I realized nobody's going to rescue me from this. I have to figure this out for myself. So the story I want to tell is about how in the late 90s, I had been switching my career from the world I was in, which was graphics and design and creating signage for sporting events and for businesses, and switch over to being a programmer. I'd been programming over 15 years at that time. And so I decided I'm actually going to sell my business and do programming. I was loving it so much. And the first job that I found was just ideal. For 3 months, I was hired to manage a small team and also to do programming. So, because the boss, the guy who hired me, was going to be traveling to the customers for a few months to spend time solving some problems for another company. So to me, it was really great. Matter of fact, after a week or two, I was telling my wife how I'm really glad I'm switching into this software development stuff, because the people here are just so smart. They understand how to make things work well. They understand the problems of the workplace. And this was before Agile. And yet here was the boss flying to the customer. So he was directly collaborating with the engineers at the customer of these different companies he was needing to help solve a problem for. And we worked all together in the same room. We had a big whiteboard where we put up all our work. It was almost all the things that we would now call Agile a few years before Agile came to be.
And it was Agile without the name, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a good phraseology. Agile without the name. In those days, they were calling them lightweight processes. And the guy who was managing this shop, he understood this stuff innately. And I don't think that he needed to read what others were thinking about. He just was naturally making a good place to work, where everybody could share their ideas. We could try their ideas. Everybody was willing to hear each other, what each other was saying. And we worked at a gentle pace. So all of these things were really good. And this was a very sought after little operation. They had no lack of work. And so, but that was just a 3-month contract while this guy was traveling, that I was to be there. We would communicate with him every day, every morning. We would talk, and we would do the work that he deemed we needed to get done. And by the end of the day, we were deploying it to the customer. So you put all that together, and it's like modern software development. However, when that contract ended and we had solved the problems for these companies, I went off to my second contract. So this was in the days when you could just get hired onto a contract to do work for a certain period of time, and everybody was desperate to get developers. And as a matter of fact, if you could spell VB, you could get a job as a programmer, right? So it wasn't too hard getting work. So I decided for the second job, I wanted to go to a place that was really big, because here were these people. I was just so happy to be in this field where everybody was so intelligent and working in such a good manner.
And working together, right? Like it wasn't just ordering each other around.
So we were really collaborating. And so we weren't collaborating in the way to the degree that mob programming is collaborating, but we would all be looking at the work together, and somebody would say, oh, I'll take care of that. Somebody would say, I'll take care of that. And while we were doing it, we were frequently talking with each other because we're sitting next to each other. So the next, I looked for another contract to replace this one. And it was with a big company because I wanted to see how the big companies do it. I figure if a small company can do this, I can imagine how good it must be at a big company. And that was a trick I played on myself. You know, when I got
there, were still young, and I
was so young.
Yeah,
that's right.
Innocent.
When I got to that second place, the first day or two were pretty good. We were put on teams. And I joined a team of very bright young people that were about half my age, all college graduates, and I really loved it. And yet, after just a few days, I started noticing the dysfunction in the group. We were all still sitting in the same room, but that each team of 5, 6, 7 people. But, well, no, I take that back. Some of the teams were just in cubicles. Ours was in the same room, but there was no collaboration. We weren't working together. But then worse problems started coming forward. One of them was it was very high pressure. They were expecting a lot out of these people, but there was no way they could deliver. And it wasn't their fault. It wasn't their fault they couldn't deliver. It's because the requirements were being shoveled onto the teams. Then I started noticing that the managers were making it harder for everybody to work. We were being called to meetings all the time. There was a lot interfering with our ability to be effective. And by the end of 3 months, I was starting to think, I'm not going to renew this contract. It's just not very good. At the end of 6 months, I did leave. But the biggest thing I noticed, and Vasco, you know a lot about this, I started noticing 3 main problems. And when we did retrospectives, and we did them every 6 weeks, they didn't call them retrospectives. This is still pre-agile.
They were probably called postmortems or something,
well,
right?
They called them lessons learned.
Okay, well, that's better than postmortem.
That's right, because it really wasn't postmortem. We were still in the middle of the beast. The beast had not yet died. We were writing a project that was supposed to be done in 3 to 6 months, and it wasn't going to be done in even 6 months. It actually took them another 18 months. I often ask people, how long is a 3-month project? And almost everybody will say, yeah, 2 years. You know, so that's how this was. So, but there were worse things than this. The people on the job were being sort of arbitrarily switched between teams, or even switched to different locations, working on different projects. There was too much upheaval. Nobody was given the chance to collaborate for very long in some cases. I was doing my best to find ways to keep it calm for everyone. And I hate to say this, but they thought most of the kids, because they were all quite a bit younger than me on the project, started thinking of me kind of like their father, so they could come to me with their problems.
Yeah, so they wanted to have like a friendly shoulder to cry on. Is that what you mean?
Yeah. Oh, I actually had people come to me and say, Woody, there's something I want to talk to you about. Can we go into this room over here? We go in the room, and they would start crying because of something that was done to them by a manager. And, you know, something such as they just told me I have to, so we're in San Diego. They just told me that I have to move to a project that's in Washington, D.C. That's 3,000 miles away. So that means they have to cancel their housing, move all their stuff. it was a big pressure.
So they were probably felt, or from what you describe, I'm imagining they probably felt a little bit like treated as resources.
Yes, you could say pawns in somebody else's chess game, where they had no decision whether they were going to be attacked by the other side's queen at any moment. They just felt like pieces being moved around on a board. And there was
this was the beginning. You were not yet, how would I say it, a seasoned developer at that time, because it's the beginning of your contract. Or did I misunderstand that?
Yeah, I had been programming for over 15 years, but I'd only been running software that I used in my own business. So this was my first exposure really to how software development is done in organizations.
Especially in large organizations in this second story.
Especially in large organizations. As a matter of fact, when it came close to I'd already renewed my contract once. When it came close to renew again, because it was taking them longer than they thought, I really realized I want to find a contract or a job, we can think of it that way, like the first one, not like the second one.
And is that when you started thinking about what makes a workplace wonderful? Is that when you first started to kind of put different observations and ideas together?
So in the early 90s, I started a company. Before that, I had several companies. I've had about 16 little businesses over my life. And I started a company in 1991, I think it was. And by that time, I had learned the lesson that I'd turned into a boss that nobody would want. And so when I realized that, I thought I've got to change myself. So in the early 90s, I had started thinking about how can we make it where everybody can organize and manage themselves. And I started reading books on the topic because I didn't want to tell people what to do. I wanted them to just be able to find what they should be doing without somebody instructing them. And we actually came up with processes to do that. And that was helped along by the people working in the company, this little company I had. We had about 10 employees. We figured out how to make a self-directed workplace, at least to some degree. This was my early experimentations with it. But my wife had pointed out to me, I enjoyed the programming, the software development more than I was the work we were actually doing in our business. And I should consider changing my business. But she had another motive. I think she knew if we got rid of this business, then she wouldn't have to work in it anymore. And she didn't like working in it. She was really becoming an artist, and she wanted to just be an artist. And that's how she makes her living now, writing children's books and illustrating children's books. So, but she convinced me that this is good to have a spouse who can convince you to do the better things in your life. So I had already been thinking about it quite a bit. So I recognized this. Matter of fact, I started watching the patterns at this second place. And one of the patterns was they would...
and these are the patterns of a bad workplace.
Yes. I started mentioning this a second ago. In our first retrospective, which I call retrospective now, I noticed the three main things that came forward. Their estimates were off and not helping them. They didn't understand the requirements well enough to actually do the work. And the requirements kept changing while they were doing the work. So those three things really are closely related. And this was one of the biggest problems I saw. I think that they didn't realize that the way they were trying to manage their work was not allowing them to do work well.
It's very interesting that you mentioned those three anti-patterns, because of course many of our listeners will probably recognize them immediately, yes. Perhaps even viscerally, at least for some of us.
Yes.
And one of the things that really puzzles me is I can totally see how this causes stress and confusion and bad collaboration and conflict and, of course, missed expectations and so on. But one of the things that really puzzles me, and I know we've talked a lot about this in other venues, Woody, what keeps us doing it? What are your thoughts?
Oh, my. So this is really the crux of the issue. We want to believe that software development is the same thing as, like I can use for my own self, running a sign shop. But a sign shop is, the work that we do is rather well defined. And if we think of the terms of Cynefin, it drops mostly into the complicated space, and a good chunk of it's in the simple, or now called clear space. In clear space, there are no unknowns. In complicated space, there are unknowns, but we just need to fill in the blanks. We just need to say, okay, what are the things we don't yet know about this particular chunk of work? We actually documented 47 variabilities in doing screen printing work. Screen printing where you print signage or whatever with the screen printing, and that's it. As we learned and so on at what these were, we could document them. Then we could know, oh, we're having a problem. We just have to identify the problem, and then we know the solution. Well, with software development, the simplicity isn't there. What we have is the complex space. And in the complex space, as soon as we know there's a problem, we can't identify the problem. We know it's happening. We're only seeing symptoms. And it's not until we start trying some solutions that we even start getting an understanding of the problem. So this is more of a discovery process. And that's what most software development is. If we're not finding we're needing to discover stuff, I would argue that we're probably not really doing development. We're redoing things that we've already done before. And in software development, when that happens, we start seeing that pattern. It's time to automate things. Mm-hmm. It's time to write some libraries maybe that we use. Take the common things and not write them over and over again. So when we're doing development is very specific. It means we are creating something new. If we're doing product development, and our product development really just entails taking apart somebody else's electronic device, figuring out how they made it, and then making it, we're not doing development anymore. And so in this case, we're not doing development when we're doing software work, if it's just configuration or doing work we've done before. Yeah, so this is one of the problems. This is only one of the problems. The bigger problem is, a friend of mine says...
Yves wanted to come in. Yves.
Oh, please do. Yes.
Yeah, well, I wanted to come in because this is something I've seen explicitly in during the pandemic, that we humans are really bad in such a complex space, because everybody around us wants the simple solution. Why don't we just do this and then the pandemic is gone? Well, no.
Yes.
And it became very clear for me that especially the I would say the agile people who know and understand Cynefin, we understand that this is not a simple problem. But it was hard for many people around us, I think.
Yeah, and I would like to add to that the fact that we can only see the symptoms of the problem, right? In the complex world, we can only see the symptoms. And we have at least part, if not complete, opacity of causes, meaning that even when we start to see the patterns in the symptoms, we don't necessarily know what's causing it. And you can see this by having a retrospective where team members are saying, no, it's this that is causing it. No, it's that is causing it, right? Like when there's this conflict, it's one example of that. And because of that, then what we are left with is trying things out, right? Literally trying small things, and this is where the tip "turn up the good" comes from as well, that Woody shared in the book Tips from the Trenches for Scrum Masters. This idea that you have to find what's working, improve it, or try something and see the results, and constantly start this cycle of trial and learning, right?
Yeah, and I think we can emphasize that quite a bit here. We still may not understand the problem until we're deep into this experimental stage. And there's a warning here, I think. For one thing, if you ever hear somebody say, we need to solve this once and for all, you know that they don't really understand there is no once and for all. There's no for all. There's no happy ever after. Because today's solution just becomes tomorrow's problem. This happens all the time. So this year, we're solving the things we thought were working for us last year. And then next year, we're going to be solving the solutions that we came up with to solve this year's perceived problems. It's perceived problems. And this is why I like Turn Up the Good so much. What we noticed for ourselves was, as we become, at the end of each day, if we notice what was good and turn that up just a little bit, we have to, this means we need to be paying attention. If we're paying attention to what's bad only, we're never going to get the progress that we really want. We'll miss the good things because
And it's so tempting to focus on the bad things, huh?
That's what we're built for. That's what we're built for. It's like I've recently been saying, I think my ancestors somewhere way back, when they heard a lion roar in the middle of the night and it woke them up, they didn't cower in the corner of their little cave. They grabbed their spears and go, "Hey, that's tomorrow's breakfast," and they'd run out and get that food, So I think that we take action when we're confronted with problems, and then we forget. Because we're not paying attention to what's good, we don't multiply the good. And I think multiplying the good is a more meaningful thing to do.
And also, it fits the understanding and the acceptance that we live in a complex environment where we don't necessarily understand cause and effect. At least we don't have full transparency to cause and effect in a complex environment. And by focusing on what's good, even when it doesn't work, at least it's not trying to completely change the dynamics, but it's rather occupying the space with better things, which of course, and this is, I think, one of the key, perhaps even magic aspects of this turn up the good idea, it occupies the space that was previously taken by things that are not so good.
That's right.
Right. And I love that turn up the good idea explained, I would say, even in the extreme when you talk about mob programming. So can you tell us a little bit about how you go from turn up the good to mob programming?
So this was an interesting occurrence for me. I had already understood this turn up the good in my own life and with teams I had been working with over the past 10 years leading up to 2011, when I worked with the team where we kind of created or originated the idea of mob programming. We were watching, and I was having there every morning, we would ask ourselves to watch today what goes well. And at the end of the day, we would all share something that went well that day. And then we'd ask our question, which one of these are we going to turn up for tomorrow? And I really had learned this on my very first job at age 12 or 13, because that's what my boss would do, but he would do it on a weekly basis. He would say, pay attention this week to what goes well, or not slightly different, what we could do better. It's not really just turning up the good. What can we do better? And he always phrased it in that way. For example, if I noticed the hoses were leaking because I was watering plants, then turning up the good on that is, it would be nicer if I didn't have to trod through all this wet ground while I'm doing my work. And so we tried to phrase it in a way of, let's turn up what we like by, introducing something. In this case, I took it a step further. Let's just look for what went well. And at the end of every day, I remember one day particularly, somebody said, we were pair programming, and because they were learning to do that. And boy, we got to the solution really quickly. And so when we decided how to turn up the good on that, there's at least 5 or 6 ways. One is to say, well, let's do more pair programming. But another way is to say, let's try doing pair other things. Like if I'm going to a meeting, I'll bring someone with me. Then 2 of us will go to that meeting. Now, you might say, oh, that's wasteful, but that's an experiment to try. When they came back from that the next day, or the end of that day, they said, boy, that was a lot better because I now had someone to help me explain what I was there to explain and help me understand the messages that came back. Because once we got back together after the meeting, we had 2 different perspectives on what happened. So then we made a little practice. How do we turn up the good on that? Well, for every meeting for the next week or 2, let's take a buddy with us. So this was how we were learning how to turn up the good on collaborating, everything we could see. And then this actually allowed us, because we were practicing using a coding dojo every Friday, we were practicing and learning the things that we needed to learn, and we were doing it as a group. We were now learning how to get along with each other, how to hear each other, how to better explain ourselves, how to hear the questions people are asking from their point of view, being willing to try each other's ideas. All of those things came out of turning up the good on what was already working for us. At the end of the first day that we did mob programming, which was by accident, we did our little quickie retrospective. They only take 5 minutes. We would ask, what went well today? And somebody said, boy, I learned a lot. Somebody else said, we got a lot done. And somebody said, boy, it was really high quality. And the last one was my favorite. That was fun. So to me, inside of me, I was jumping for joy. The outside of me was my usual professional, calm, cool, collected self. But any one of those was enough for me to say, I want to do more of this. But I asked the team, I said, how are we going to turn up the good for this? And they said, well, let's just book rooms for all of the day tomorrow. And whoever can show up, we would, because you can't get a room for all day long, in a big company at the last minute. So whoever wants to come, whenever you're free, you can come and join the rest of the team in this room. And we did that for a couple of weeks before we found a permanent room for ourselves. Each time it was a turn up the good. How do we turn up the good on this collaboration? Somebody said, if we had a permanent room, it would be easier for us to have our work stuff right there. Put up a big whiteboard and we could have our computer permanently set up and our projector, tuned to the way we want it. So each step of this, from before we were mob programming till we were long deep in mob programming, all the improvements we made were made by us turning up the good on something.
When you say us, you really mean the team, not just you or managers or whatever. It's really the team that decided that together, one step at a time. That's what I'm hearing. Yeah?
I would say I was nudging them to be looking for the things we weren't in the habit of looking for. What went well? So I do an exercise when I do this, with a group, and I ask them a question. I say, how many circles are in this room? And then we spend about the next minute. I say, just look around the room, count the circles. When you hit 50, put your hand up. When you hit 100, stand up. Well, within a minute or so, there's some people who are starting to stand up. Who was looking for circles before I asked them to look for circles? Nobody. And then somebody's going, boy, I got 1,000. And somebody notices, hey, everybody who's wearing a shirt with buttons, there's a bunch of circles. So we're seeing all these circles around us. Our eyes have circles, so we see somebody next to us, there's some circles. At the bottom of each chair, the lamps up above, we start seeing, and pretty soon we're seeing thousands of circles. But until we remind ourselves, and don't go looking for circles, that's not going to be a big benefit. But if we remind ourselves every morning, let's pay attention to what's going well. If we just remind ourselves every morning of that, then we will get a benefit. If we then at the end of each day review what we did, instead of at the end of every week or every 2 weeks, that time is wasted if we wait a week. It has to be fresh in us.
It's actually turning up the good on the retrospectives to do it every day.
This is turning. So I think I learned the daily retrospective from Mary Poppendick, although she wasn't talking about retrospectives. She said something like this in a talk I heard her give. She said, if something's kind of not giving you the value you think you should be getting from it, try doing it more frequently and see if that affects it. And this is how I got on the daily retrospective. I now know people who are doing an hourly retrospective. It takes them about a minute, and they end up at the end of the day being able to review how things went during the day. When things were really going good, what were the things we were noticing? And this is done in a turn up the good manner. The people that I'm talking about are doing this.
And I think that perspective really helps us as Scrum Masters, because if we think about it, of course, we want to wait for the retrospective to, organize maybe, a fun exercise and to have some team building and so on. And that's perfectly okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But this aspect of constantly getting small improvements in place all the time, and not just any improvements, but rather improvements on things that are already working, then, of course, we're going to get a lot more improved by the end of the sprint, right? Like we can have the retrospective still at the end of the sprint.
You can this doesn't preclude...
And you will see them right away, because if you wait another week, you won't see them. Just like what Woody said earlier about the 1,000 circles. If you look around, you see thousands of things to improve. If I just look at that once a week or once every 2 weeks, I will just remember like 2 or 3 things. And if I look around all the time, I have 1,000 things to improve.
So we're observing something here that's really critical, and that's the compounding effect of doing things daily instead of weekly or monthly. Now, I know for myself, that if I'm not focused on something, it will slide by. I won't even notice it happening. So you need to kind of have a habit. And this is maybe the bottom line of this. You need to have a habit that allows this to happen. If you don't build the habit, it will fade away for you. So the habit, that was my job as the manager of the team. And I had made it clear when they hired me, I'm not going to be a manager of the team. I'm going to be a responsible person on the team whose job is to make sure the team gets better and better. But I'm not going to manage them in the traditional sense. These are grown-ups. They know how to manage themselves. Nobody needs to tell them. What we need to do is give them the freedom to do that. We usually take that away by saying, okay, you're going to work on this, you're going to work on that, or you're going to be going to these meetings, you're going to go to those meetings. We don't need to make that determination for them. Every team is built of people who are at least as good as we are at being an adult and taking responsibility and getting things done.
And that's something that I read many years ago in Maverick by Ricardo Semler, where he said, we expect people outside their job to be fully functioning adults. They invest in houses, right. They drive cars, they have kids, a lot more important than any software we might deliver. They vote for the president or the parliament or whatever. And yet when they come to work, we expect them to be like children.
That's right.
To do what we tell them and not to think for themselves. And I think that's something, that's a mentality, kind of a paradigm that somehow has grown in the corporate world that we need to step away from. And I think that your story is a great example of that, right? Like just always involving the team in what needs to improve or what is already working well that we want to get better, and have the team own how they work.
Yes. So if you recall back to my first story where I worked at one company and I worked at another, you've just described that dichotomy. The first company understood these people could get this work done if I'm not sitting next to them. So I got to travel to the customer. I just need to make sure they know how to do that. And if we've not given people, this is going to be a good story to share. I won't tell any details. I went into a company once where the people were not allowed to ask someone else for help because that demonstrated they didn't know their job. And if you helped somebody who came to you to ask for help, then you were taking
somebody else
abusing
job,
the company's.
Right?
Yeah, you're abusing the company's money because you should be able to do your work without somebody else helping you do it. So this is like the deepest level of micro control of saying you better know what you're doing or else you shouldn't be working here. Well, that's different if our field is in the simple space, or this clear space, but we're in the complex space.
So as a result, people didn't ask questions and it took them like probably triple or quadruple the time, right?
Yeah, I think it was a lot worse than that. I think that eventually that ended up with them being almost frozen, not being able to get things done.
But they didn't ask for help, so Woody, so that's fine. They is
that Deming or who was it that said if you give a manager a numeric goal, they will destroy the company in their attempt to maintain that. That's not exactly the same thing, but this is related. If our goal is wrong and we're instructing people that way, but I think there's a really important aspect to this, and that is that the person that's doing the work in a modern company was brought into the company because their knowledge was necessary to our effort. And so we've brought people in because we know we need that knowledge, but then we hamper it by the way we arrange doing the work. So this is why collaboration and things like mob programming isn't like they say, it's not a silver bullet. The idea is we're just turning up the good on collaboration. That can be done in many other ways.
Yeah, and mob programming is just one application of this idea of working together, right? Like the best minds working together all the time.
That's right.
In the same place on a problem. Woody, we're about to finish. I did not want to finish though without asking you and Yves for one advice that Scrum Masters could put in practice right away after hearing this inspiring episode. What can we do as Scrum Masters to turn up the good?
I could go first if you like.
Go for it.
So I think that that making a shorter cycle between retrospectives is something to experiment with. So you might not be able to jump to a once a day or once an hour retrospective, but if you just remember that doing it more frequently could be beneficial, then try it in different ways. I think that that's what we're doing. That goes with almost anything, right? If this is Kent Beck's idea of turning up the good, that if a practice we have is working for us, can we turn that up? And we don't need to know how high it can be turned up. We can just start cranking it up. If we go too high, we'll probably sense that pretty quickly. So there you go. There's a short tip. Yeah.
Absolutely. Love that. All the way up to 11. Yves, your tip.
Well, for me, that would be kind of similar way in asking for help, but asking for help at the moment that you don't think you need any help.
Oh,
Because
I love that.
we're typically rather good in asking for help when we know we need help. A little bit like what Woody said, that was not possible in that one company. But what I've learned most is trying to ask for help at the right moment that my ego tells me I know everything, I don't need help. When I feel that urge, I start to ask for help the last, I think, 5 years. And almost every time I'm surprised what I learn. So it's hard on my ego, because my ego really tells me like I don't need any help, I have the solution. But every time I can set that ego aside and ask for help, I'm always I'm stumped with what I learn. It's always very interesting.
Absolutely. 2 inspiring tips right there. So last thing, Woody and Yves, in that order, where can people find you and more about the work that you're doing?
Well, I do have a website. I've got 4 or 5 of them. I don't ever update them. But one of them is mobprogramming.org. I don't think I've added anything there since before the pandemic. But you could at least read a few articles I've written about some of the ideas. woodyzuill.com is another, but all it's got is a picture of me and a place where you can contact me. So if you really want to talk to me soon, ping me in LinkedIn or in Twitter. If you don't know what Twitter is, just go online and search for that, right?
Yeah. We'll put the link to those websites and, of course, a LinkedIn page on.
I'm just Woody Zuill in both LinkedIn and in Twitter.
Absolutely. Yves?
Well, for me, that would be my last name .be, so hanoulle.be, and on Twitter as well. My name is not as unique as Woody's name, because I have a nephew with the exact same name, but both on LinkedIn and on Twitter, you would be able to find me as well, indeed.
Absolutely. And we'll put the link in the show notes so that people can easily find you and ask you questions. Woody and Yves, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for your generosity with your time and your knowledge.
Thank you. I really love whenever we get a chance to talk. We used to talk almost every day way back when in 2012 and 13. So I miss those times.
We really hope you liked our show. And if you did, why not rate this podcast on Stitcher or iTunes? Share this podcast and let other Scrum Masters know about this valuable resource for their work. Remember that sharing is caring.